Clap your hands if you work at the technology company or in the tech industry. Okay, not surprising where we are. Now clap your hands for me if you think that tech companies are part of the solution when it comes to addressing climate change. All right, optimistic, I like it. Clap your hands now for me if you think tech companies are part of the problem that is making climate change worse. I want to do that one more time. Solution? Problem. Okay, Brad, you're going to have some things to answer for. Well, it's not just climate change, of course. These days, big companies are under more pressure than ever before to tackle issues on the social and political fronts. They're in the middle of the culture wars. And how brands engage and how CEOs show up on everything from gun rights to reproductive rights to voting rights is as much a part of the story as the markets these days. And it's something I've been covering very closely for many years now at the time. We're going to go into all of this and more with one of the senior leaders at one of the biggest tech companies in the world right now. So I'm thrilled to welcome to the stage Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Brad leads the company's work on everything from cybersecurity to climate to AI and more, and really takes a global perspective. And we've gotten this far in the day without addressing one of the biggest stories in the world right now, which is the war in Ukraine. Now, that is a war that has energy at the very heart of the conflict and is having enormously disruptive effects to the energy markets around the globe, and by extension, the climate story. And so, Brad, I wonder if you could start by helping us understand, from your perspective, where you sit, and you're able to see some of these issues from a lot of different vantage points. As you think about the ripple effects from this terrible war, is this, from the perspective of climate change and your work that you've been doing with the corporate sector and with the public sector and the efforts to reduce emissions overall and move towards a net zero economy, is the war just by definition slowing that progress? Is this essentially just a blow towards the globe's climate efforts?
It's fascinating, and the question's well-timed. I was in Europe for all of last week. I was in 4 different cities meeting with government, business, journalists, civil society leaders. And the first thing I would say is, David, I think you hit the nail on the head. This war is having really substantial ripple effects, especially around energy and food. It's really the two, and they go hand in hand. And my take on the energy situation is that in the short run, the war is bad news for the work needed to reduce carbon emissions. Obviously, we're seeing countries having to scurry to figure out how to replace their reliance on Russian gas. You see a renewed interest in coal, if coal is what it will take to stay warm this winter. You see this extraordinary focus that is completely understandable about just electricity bills. Yeah. You can go to the UK and you have people who are worrying, what does it mean if their electricity bill this winter is 7 times what it was last winter? All of that is likely this winter to take us backwards. Now, what is most interesting to me as I really have the chance to dig in and learn more is that almost everything that is going to make this winter harder and this year more difficult will, I believe, also accelerate the energy transition and make the decade as a whole better. Yeah. Because it is causing people to do more and just think more broadly about different sources of energy, certainly accelerating investments in wind and solar, new generation of nuclear power as well. So it's going to be a hard winter. But this will help us when we get to the year 2030 and beyond.
That's a great overview. I want to remind our guests in the audience that there are note cards on your seats with pencils. You can write a question, give your name, and send it to the aisle, and we'll try to incorporate some of them in the next session or so. So that's useful, and I think makes a lot of sense. I wonder, though, when you go down a level from that very meta picture to the corporate level, you obviously see not only the effects on energy prices, but I have to believe it's starting to show up in your business. You've got a big and growing business building data centers. You work with companies to deal with their energy needs. How are companies addressing this energy crunch? And how is it affecting their own net zero targets? Are any of them saying, you know, our net zero push is taking a back seat because of these simple realities of it's, you know, we got to pay the bills, we got to keep the lights on?
I think it's a little too early to know.
Okay.
I think that this topic is frankly most pronounced in Europe.
Yep.
West Coast of the United States, you just don't feel this the same way. There definitely is a focus across Europe in reducing electricity consumption this winter. The European Union last week said it wanted to see electricity consumption reduced by 10%. That's probably going to hit people at home and their thermostats. It's going to be a colder winter inside as well as out. They are recognizing that it's not going to help Europe if we all have to close manufacturing plants and the like. But it's definitely increasing, I think, a sense of responsibility we all have, including in the tech sector. And I share the applause for people who say that tech is part of the solution and part of the problem at the same time, because we are continuing to build huge data centers. And we can point out, and we do because it's true, that if you can move computing from, say, older servers and server rooms and corporate data centers into the hyperscale data centers, they are far more energy efficient. We don't even have heaters in any of our data centers that we've been building because we recycle heat from the computers themselves. But, there's a big but, we have a tremendous responsibility to drive our own energy efficiency, and most importantly, I think, to keep investing both to bring on more renewable energy for ourselves and to support the grid, and even more than this, I view our fundamental role, our most fundamental role, certainly at a company like Microsoft, is to really help the world innovate its way out of this climate crisis.
Good.
So there's more for us to do.
Absolutely, and I want to talk about your work with other companies, but first let's stick with the company itself. Microsoft, much to its credit, was very early in setting aggressive, ambitious net zero targets. We heard earlier from Andrew at the Bezos Earth Fund about the Amazon Climate Pledge that so many companies have taken. Microsoft went further, not only pledging to get to net zero, but also to somehow remove all the carbon that the company accounts that it has been responsible for contributing to the atmosphere since its inception. Pretty extraordinary. And by all accounts, you are on the path there. And yet, I think there's a real temptation to confuse commitments with progress these days. And the reality is that many companies may say that they're on the path, but are still lagging far behind what is going to be needed to actually achieve true net zero by 2050 or even 40. So can you give us a clear-eyed assessment of just how far along companies are in getting to net zero, which of course is not even close to the same thing as getting an economy that is net zero? And what are the obstacles and what it will take for them to get closer?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, so far, by our count, 3,470 companies in the world, accounting for almost 80% of global GDP, have made a climate pledge. And that's good. I mean, you have to start with good intentions. But I see a lot of similarity between this issue and the world's work, the tech sector's not so successful work, to build a more diverse and inclusive industry. And one of my lessons from that experience has always been, if you have good intentions but not accurate or transparent measurement, you are most likely to deceive yourself into thinking you are making progress even when you are not. Yeah. It's like, so what does that mean? The first thing it means is we need standardized, accurate, global measurement systems for carbon emissions. Carbon accounting. I love to romance carbon accounting because without carbon accounting, we will never build a net zero world. The next thing I think you should really ask every company to do is to first just start with itself. Hold itself to a high bar for transparency, connect progress to the compensation of senior leaders. That's the way it is at Microsoft. Just like diversity, you should ask people if they know their numbers. I can tell you that at Microsoft in 2021, we accounted for 14 million metric tons of carbon. I can tell you that our Scope 3 emissions accounted for 97.96% of our total. I can tell you we grew our business by 20% while reducing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 17%. That was terrific, but I can also tell you that our Scope 3 emissions went up by 23% last year, in part because in a pandemic, people really like to play their Xbox games. Right. But the main thing is everybody needs to know their numbers, and then they have to have a clear and I think feasible, actionable strategy to drive their numbers down. And then they should be measured every single year. And we should recognize, in my own opinion, that for many companies, and indeed countries and governments, we may see certain Scope 3 emissions go up early in this decade to make the investments needed to drive all 3 scopes down in the latter half of the decade. And if so, then we should understand that. But what this really means is talking about climate without talking about numbers is just an exercise that may raise aspirations, but ultimately lead to disappointment. And so we have to bring all of this together.
Well, I really applaud the commitment to transparency, and I think the work of actually doing that in a standardized way is one of the great challenges facing so many corporations in the years ahead. You mentioned Scope 3 emissions a few times in that response, and without getting into the details, Scope 3 emissions, of course, are the emissions created by the people who use your products. Is that a fair enough way to say it?
As well as suppliers. So you've got the supply chain and the value chain.
Thank you.
It's everything except what you emit yourself through Scope 1 or you emit for the electricity you consume.
And Microsoft is among the companies that is committed to bringing its Scope 3 emissions down to net zero as well, yes. Which begs the question, how do you actually go about that? Briefly, walk us through the thinking of how you actually take responsibility for someone else's energy usage.
Well, first of all, it's a lot easier to do on the supply chain. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to get your suppliers to report accurately their emissions on the work they do for your products. In 2020, we only had accurate reporting from 12% of our suppliers. A year later, we were up to 88%. You have to be prepared, frankly, to spend money on what Bill Gates calls the green premium. We build data centers. Guess what? These buildings are always built out of the same thing, steel. But we pay a green premium because then you get steel that is produced in a more carbon-friendly way. Now, I'll tell you what's completely broken and that what we have to fix systemically around the world. When companies or governments report their carbon emissions, it is all based, in my view, on a vastly outdated system based on cost accounting. What does that mean? Basically, you have somebody who looks up how much money they spent on steel last year. They then look up a table that is a standardized table that says, on average, how much carbon is emitted for every dollar you spend on steel. That's the way it works today. It's not connected to direct sources of emissions. So what happens when you pay more money to buy greener steel? That system of accounting says your emissions are going up rather than down. What this really shows, when you just cut through it all, is we have to rewire the entire economy to drive the innovations that are needed to incentivize companies and governments and NGOs to make the purchases that are needed and then stimulate innovation. But it's enormously complex, and that's why I think the first half of this decade is fundamentally about simplifying, standardizing, and incentivizing the innovation that's needed.
Yeah. The focus that I hear just crystal clear is yours on driving down emissions. And I mean, it's a through line in just about every response. And Microsoft continues to work with fossil fuel companies. It's a conversation I had with John Doerr earlier today on this stage, and I want you to talk to us about how you think about it. A couple years ago, when the company signed a big new partnership with Chevron, there was real outcry from employees, and yet earlier this year, the company, one of your associates, doubled down on the company's commitment to continuing work with the fossil fuel companies. Square that circle for us. If the focus at the company is so intently on driving down emissions, why continue to help oil and gas companies produce more?
Well, the first thing I would say is, look, we are drawing some lines. We came out with energy principles in March. Fundamentally, we said our goal is to work with the energy sector to drive the energy transition that's needed. There are many things we will do. There are some things we will not do. You do have to put in guardrails and know when you have a line you don't want to cross. So we said that when it comes to work using our technical resources, our engineering resources on things like exploration and extraction, where people would say there's already enough oil that has been discovered in the world, we won't do that unless the company that we're working with has made a net zero pledge that we believe is credible. The one thing I will say, though, and this is just my own personal perspective, it's right for people to focus on what we have to stop doing. We have to stop using gas. We especially have to stop using coal. That's probably the first thing we really have to stop. The key to stop doing these things is to start doing the things that will replace them. One of the things we all have to keep in mind, in my view, is every study that has been produced shows that between now and 2050, the world needs to triple its production of electricity. And that includes bringing electricity to the 770 million people in this world. Think about that. Twice the population of the United States who woke up today without electricity, because there is never a day that they wake up with electricity. So then you look at something like coal. There's 381 coal-fired power plants in the United States. There's two ways to look at those. One is to say, that's 381 plants we need to shut down. The other way to look at it is to say that there's at least 2/3 of those plants that we can convert. So instead of burning coal, they can run small modular reactors, SMRs, or fourth-generation nuclear reactors. You can cut 30% out of the cost of building a nuclear reactor. If we go to these plants, they're connected to the grid. They have water cooling capacity already. And you know what else they have? Every one of them has 1,200 people who make their living, typically in a rural community. Well-trained people. They know how to run an electricity plant. If we retrain them to run a nuclear plant, we shut down a coal plant, we replace it with cleaner energy, we save jobs, we expand electricity production. So if you want to stop one thing, start something better.
I just got to follow up. Sure. Yes, and I don't have time for clapping.
That's okay.
Put your policy hat on and be pragmatic here. I mean, converting 200 coal plants in the United States to modular nuclear reactors sounds like a great story. Given your understanding of the regulatory environment, the realities of NIMBYism in this country, how feasible is that in your expectations?
It's completely feasible for two reasons, at least two things that I have seen. One, the misnamed Inflation Reduction Act should have been more aptly named the Carbon Reduction Act. 84% of the spending in that law that Congress passed is focused on climate. And a big chunk of it is going to the loan office in the Department of Energy, including $250 billion of loan guarantees that can go to coal-powered plants. So the money will be there. Now you get to the point that you just captured, I think, so well. Yes, but is the know-how there? No. If you run a coal plant, you don't know how to turn it into a nuclear plant. Do we have the permitting processes? Do we have the permitting speed we will need in this country to accelerate this transition? No. So how do we do that? This is where working at a company like Microsoft is one of the most fun places in the world to work, in my own opinion, if you care about climate. We had employees that in a hackathon that I had the benefit of helping to sponsor 2 years ago came up with a project that is now being pursued with our support by a nonprofit called TerraPraxis. What are they doing? Two things. They're working with scientists and engineers to standardize all the engineering work needed to convert a coal plant into a nuclear plant. They're also working with our help and help from scientists at MIT to streamline the permitting process. Their goal, thinking globally, is roughly to convert 40 power plants a year, every year, between 2022 and 2050. So when people ask, as you should, especially a journalist should, the skeptical questions, I would say 4 words: it can be done. And almost every aspect of what we need to do in this world, I look at and say, as I keep learning more, it can be done.
Well, let's hope so. We could talk about the energy transition all day, but you brought up the IRA, which made me think of Washington, which made me think of politics. And one of the things I cover here at the Times is the growing pushback from the right, because that's where it's coming from, against ESG, environmental, social, governance principles in investing, but across the industry, across the corporate world. The E in that is where so much of the heat from this growing pushback is being directed. And I've written story after story about state legislatures, about efforts at the national level to penalize corporations that are trying to move towards a net zero future, and to penalize companies that are actually trying to make good on some of their DEI pledges even. As this pushback grows, and it is growing, they are passing laws. State treasurers are pulling hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars out of BlackRock because they have made that the poster child company of this issue. And if Republicans take the House, I think there is every expectation among every one of my sources in the corporate world that they are going to have hearings and drag CEOs, including perhaps your own, up to Capitol Hill and grill them about ESG. How does this change your thinking about pursuing everything from net zero pledges to DEI to all the other things that are part of your very, very well articulated ESG strategy?
I don't know that it changes our outlook, but it certainly encourages even more thought, which isn't really ever the worst thing in the world, to have to think more. I would say a few things. I mean, one, I strongly believe that being a leader of a company is not a license to use the company's name or platform to endorse whatever policy view the leaders of the company happen to personally embrace. That isn't appropriate. So the first thing you have to know is your mind, and you have to have principles that will help you decide when you will engage and use the company's voice and when you will not. So for several years, we've had a clear view of the 3 criteria we look to. Number 1, is it a policy issue that impacts our customers and their use of our or similar technology? Number 2, is it an issue that impacts our employees and their ability to work and live in the community? Number 3, does it impact the rest of our business? And we don't take a position, no matter how passionate we may be on, frankly, something like gun control, where we haven't taken a position because it hasn't met any of those 3 criteria in what is obviously our own judgment, because it is ultimately an issue of judgment. But we will stand up and use our voice on something like the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate-related provisions there, because we did feel that it affected all of those things, including, frankly, our own ability to get the renewable energy needed for our data centers. And then I'll just say 2 other things. One, I do think you have to have the power of persistence and conviction and courage, because there will be arrows that come the other way back at you. But second, I believe in dialogue. I mean, I sit down all the time with people who are on the other side of an issue, the other side of the aisle, people who have different views about companies. And if there's one thing I will say time and time again, that when people are concerned about the views of companies because they see it as political views undermining shareholder interests, I say, let's step back and look more broadly. And I will argue that if you take a principled approach, you apply this criteria, you will serve your shareholders well. And I always then say, Exhibit A, the share price of Microsoft Corporation. When Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014, as some of you knew, It felt like a fixed price stock instrument. It was always $25, regardless of how much the company was growing. And we did put this customer needs first, and we did put employee needs first. And guess what? We saw a tenfold increase in our share price. I do believe if you take care of these others, if you think about the communities where you work, your shareholders will be among the greatest beneficiaries.
That may be true, but I'm not going to let you end the panel with an advertisement for Microsoft stock. So I have one more question, even though we're going over time. Microsoft has a long and tortured relationship with regulators. And this is a moment where many people say regulation is needed, where the private sector itself does not have the capacity or the incentive structures to really make the fundamental changes needed. Very briefly, what are the 1 or 2 or 3 areas you think regulators at the federal or state level have the power to make meaningful regulations that would accelerate the transition to net zero?
Well, we put out 2 papers 3 weeks ago in this space. One is on energy policy, electricity policy. The other is on carbon policy. I think we're going to need a third one around waste, especially waste for something like digital devices. But fundamentally, when it comes to carbon policy, we believe there needs to be local, state, national, global policy around measurement, around reduction, and around removal to drive all of the things needed to get to a net zero world. When it comes to electricity policy, we need 3 things. We need policies that are going to bring more renewable sources of energy online. We need policies that are going to modernize the electrical grid. And we need policies that are going to advance equitable justice, not just for underprivileged communities in this country where the issues are severe, but for the global South as well. So we are proponents of what I would almost call an activist policy agenda in those spaces. They will serve the world well.
Well, you heard it here first. Microsoft is now pro-regulation, and we're glad that Brad joined us on stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.